Good morning. Welcome to the library. Thanks so much for joining us. As was said, my name is Chris Davenport. I'm a reporter at the Washington Post. And today's panel is Reforming How the Pentagon Does Business. What does it take to roll back the red tape? First, I'd just like to thank the staff and the leadership of the library for having us. This is such an amazing event. Last year, Mike Allen of Politico called this the Davos of Defense. And I think that's accurate, especially considering the amazing panel we have with us today. So amazing, in fact, that in a moment of weakness just backstage, I promised Chairman McKeon that they were so impressive we should be able to figure this thing out in the hour and 15 minutes that we have. So I've set a high bar for us today, and I hope we can live up to it. So we have an hour and 15 minutes, as I said. We'll reserve about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions, but let me introduce our panel. On my right, obviously, is Mac Thornberry, a rancher, an attorney, and of course a member of Congress who has represented the great state of Texas in the House for nearly 20 years. He's the vice chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, where he also leads the subcommittee on intelligence, emerging threats, and capabilities. Deborah Lee James is the 23rd Secretary of the Air Force. Among other things in her amazing career, she spanned the Capitol, where she worked on the House Armed Services Committee, to the Pentagon, where she was Assistant Secretary of Defense on Reserve Affairs, and the private sector, where she was president of SAIC's Technical and Engineering Sector. Frank Kendall is the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, an attorney who's been active in human rights. He has over 40 years of experience in engineering, management, defense acquisition, and national security affairs in private industry, government, and the military. Marilyn Hewson is Chairman, President, and CEO of Lockheed Martin, the nation's largest defense company, where she's worked for more than 30 years. For the past 5 years, she's been named one of the 50 most powerful women in business by Fortune magazine, and during her tenure as CEO, in just less than 2 years, the stock price of Lockheed has doubled. Dov Zakheim. I thought that might get a little applause. Dov Zakheim is a senior fellow at the CNA Corporation and a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He has also served as a senior vice president at Booz Allen Hamilton and comptroller and chief financial officer at the Defense Department. And last, but of course not least, Arnold Pinero, a retired Marine Corps Major General and the chief executive officer of the Pinero Group. He's also chairman of the National Defense Industrial Association and chairman of the Reserve Forces Policy Board. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us. Why don't we start with we'll start with short opening statements on this incredibly important topic, starting with you, Congressman Thornberry.
Well, as everyone said, I'm very grateful for the Reagan Library for putting this together and for all these amazing folks to my right for all the help that they have already given us in Congress as we try to help work our way through what we can do to assist helping the Pentagon work better. I think it was helpful to have that conversation about sequestration downstairs because that is present in everything we do and talk about. I was struck by the point in the National Defense Panel which says that basically with sequestration it makes it very hard to do reform because you're just focused on survival. And so budget stability, hopefully, without the lower sequestration levels, is a key thing that enables reform. But in addition to that, I just believe, and I haven't yet found anybody who disagrees, that says we have to figure out a way to get more value out of the money we spend. But we also have to get faster times to get capability into the hands of people who risk their lives to defend us, as well as be faster about keeping up with technology. So that's part of what we're trying to figure out. It was about a year ago that Chairman McKeon asked me to help work with others to see what we could do, and we have listened to all sorts of folks inside, outside of government, in industry. I think I've met with everybody on this panel and benefited greatly from their wisdom. We're not going, and I think this spring we'll have a legislative package. I realize, however, that legislation is not going to solve the problem, that the first job is be like the doctors, don't make it any worse. Don't add any new layers of bureaucracy. You know, we've got enough as it is. And don't try to solve all the problems at once. You know, if you can make a few things better, then come back and try to make a few other things better in the next go around, and the next go around, and the next go around. So that's kind of the trajectory we're on as far as process. Just the last thing I'd say is it's really important that we do this. The number one reaction one gets about making the Pentagon work better is, oh right, we've heard that before. Good luck. And so there's an enormous amount of skepticism, probably shared by many of the people in this room, that anything will really get better. I think it can, it must. The world is moving too fast, and the stakes are too high for us to be satisfied with a procurement system with excess overhead, et cetera, that we have now. We've got to do better, and it's the smart minds in industry and government, inside government, outside of government, think tanks, et cetera, former officials, current officials, that can make that happen.
Secretary James.
Thank you, Chris, Mr. Chairman. And I'd also like to begin by thanking Chairman McKeon, who invited me to come to this beautiful library and to participate in this tremendous event. I'm sure he is responsible for many of the folks who are here with us today in the audience, so I want to thank him. Thanks also to the folks, the Reagan Library. I hope many of you, just like I, had the opportunity last night to take just a little bit of time, or if not, do it today, because it is well worth it. This is a fabulous museum, a fabulous place to be. And if you would permit me just one very brief story. As I was touring last night, and as I was looking at all of the different both historical and personal elements of memorabilia, I couldn't help but personalize it and think back to myself and where I was in the years of the early 1980s. And as you mentioned, for a good part of the 1980s, I was a congressional staffer on the House Armed Services Committee staff. But before that, I was something called a presidential management intern, hired originally by the Army, but I had a rotational assignment in the year 1982-83 in, of all things, the Reagan White House. And so as I looked at the memorabilia last night and all of just the beautiful photography and artwork and so forth, it took me back to my own special moment with President Reagan, where one day he just popped into our offices in the old executive office building. Now picture this, I'm all of about 23 years old. I'm a fly on the wall, but in the center of power, working in support of three gentlemen on the National Security Council staff. And there we are slaving away, and all of a sudden in walks President Reagan with a photographer in tow. And you just can't imagine how much that meant. I think it meant a lot to everybody in the office, but in particular, it meant a lot to me. And he spent perhaps 3 minutes talking to me, looking me directly in the eye, asking me about my family and me and my schooling and what I wanted to do and what I was working on. And you just can't imagine how special it made me feel. And to this day, 30-some years later, I proudly display that photograph, because I did receive a photograph on my living room table. And I learned a very important lesson that day, and that was the importance of how leaders deal with people. And I think he was just a great leader for many reasons, but he cared about people. And that is a lesson that I learned that day and have tried to always carry forth. So that was my memory as I walked around the Reagan Library last night. I recommend it to all of you. In addition to caring about people, I think the other thing President Reagan was a real leader on, it was about efficiency in government and cutting red tape, which brings me back, of course, to the subject of this panel. That is more important than ever for us in the Pentagon these days. And if I may, I'd like to just say a few words about why I think that is so. I think it's so because we have a combination of world conditions which have our military perhaps the busiest that we have been in recent memory. Things seem to be popping up all over the world in near simultaneous fashion that is presenting us with challenges and dangers to our security. We have very difficult budget conditions. We talked a lot about that in the first panel. And of course, there's a certain state of play now that we're dealing with, both in the executive branch and in Congress, in terms of coming up with gridlock as opposed to coming up with solutions to move forward. So for all of these reasons, it's really, really important that we attack the red tape and get more efficient. Now, I'll tell you on behalf of the Air Force a few startling statistics. I think they're startling. So today's Air Force, in terms of numbers of people, is the smallest Air Force that we have ever had since the beginnings of our Air Force, since we separated as a service by ourselves in the year 1947. We have fewer people today than ever before in our history. At the same time, we also have fewer aircraft than we have had in our history, and that aircraft is aging at a rather rapid rate, which means we need to modernize. Now, I don't want to be a Chicken Little that the sky is falling. At the same time that we have these fewer people, they are terrific people. They are smart, they are dedicated, they are working hard. And at the same time we have these fewer aircraft, they of course are higher tech aircraft and much more capable than aircraft from decades ago, so that's good news. But of course we have all of these operations we talked about, everything from Iraq and Syria to Ebola to our desires to pivot more or rebalance our forces to the Pacific, to the dangers associated with a resurgent Russia. All of these things are happening all at once. By the way, on Iraq and Syria, as we talk about very legitimately, what about the boots on the ground? I would hope we could all be grateful, as I am, that we have some very, very fine boots in the air. And about 70% of them have been the United States Air Force to date. And I want to just tell you, they're doing a magnificent job as well. We have concerns about our readiness. You heard that. Senator Talent talked about that's the number one thing that he thinks has suffered. If that question had been posed to me, that's exactly what I would have said. Half of our combat air forces, approximately half, are not today at the state of readiness that we want or need them to be in the event of a high-end fight. A high-end fight means going up against an enemy that has the capability to shoot us down or interfere with us in some way. So half of our combat air forces are not at the level that we would wish them to be to send them into such a battle, should it be necessary, safely. And I mentioned we need to modernize as well, because we don't want to forever be the best 1980s vintage Air Force that money can buy. We want to be the very best 21st century Air Force money can buy. So given the budget environment, I think everybody in this room knows we've had to make some tough choices, everything from retiring some of our current inventory of older aircraft, to slowing the growth in compensation, to proposing base closures, every single one of which has run into some difficulties in the Congress, and we still don't know how each of these will resolve. So bottom line, really important to lift that sequestration and also to go after that red tape and more efficiency. So just a few points of what we're doing specifically on red tape and efficiencies within the Air Force. We're reducing our headquarters by 20%. SecDef challenged all the services to do this over 5 years. We're doing it over 1 year. 20%, 1 year, it's going to happen in FY15. In addition, I, as a business person, you heard I had 14 years in industry. I'm conducting now monthly program reviews on the top weapons systems to try to bring my business experience to bear to ensure that we don't have continual cost overruns, missed schedules, missed budgets, and so forth. So I'm going to try to throw in and do my very best to contribute to that goal. Auditability of our books in the Department of the Air Force, but that's a DoD-wide issue. We're working toward that, and I think we're gonna make great strides in that area. We're gonna make it, period. We're bubbling up ideas from the field as well. We're listening to our airmen and implementing some of their ideas on how to become more efficient. And then my personal favorite is we've got what I call the Stop Doing Stuff campaign going on. So that is to say we are rigorously going through our Air Force instructions and we're trying to figure out, isn't there some of this we can stop doing? Aren't there some things that have grown up over time for reasons that we can't even remember? And let's see if we can't stop doing it. We've also launched a renewed dialogue with industry. General Welsh and I have done that, and we're trying to bring mutual items of interest to the table and work them with the objective of bending the cost curve. And I've seen many people in the audience whose companies are participating in this. Bill LaPlante is in the front row, and he is leading the charge for us on that. And finally, I will leave you with one last point that we're working on. We're trying to build, for new systems that we develop in DoD, principles of what we call strategic agility, so that we can speed it up and reduce costs for new things as we go into development and procurement. So we're building in principles like affordability right from the get-go. Let's talk about a price point right from the get-go, build it in, hold to it. Exportability. Let's think through in the beginning, should we or should we not try to export this system? And if so, let's build in exportability rather than at the very end try to figure out how to do it. More frequent pivot points so technologies can be updated, open architectures and the like. So we're working on all of these things, but the most important thing I want to come back to, panel one, is we have got to achieve compromises in government. We've got to lift sequestration and get back to the business of making government work for all of us. And although I didn't know him well, I think President Reagan would be absolutely on board with that. He certainly did it in the 1980s.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Secretary Kendall, if you would.
Chris, thank you. It's great to be here again this year. I want to recognize Chairman McKeon's service to the Congress and to his country. He's been a terrific leader. It's been great to work with him. And I'm delighted to be able to participate in the panel again. Red tape is one of the things that I've focused on through the whole series of Better Buying Power initiatives. And Deb just gave you a pretty good list of some of the things that are in there. There are various aspects to that. And what it takes to remove red tape, frankly, is constancy of purpose, tenacity, persistence, and the will to do it. And it takes a lot of time. I've been at this now for about 4 years, over 4 years. One of the first things I did when I came back into government was to look at some of the documents we require for our program milestone reviews and try to slim them down and focus them on substance and things that we actually need as opposed to all the boilerplate that we tend to collect. It is a constant struggle to proceed in that area and to succeed. There are 3 areas I'll mention real quickly that we're engaged in trying to remove red tape. The first one is one we're working with Congressman Thornberry and his staff, and also with the staff on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And that is areas that basically impose requirements on our program managers. I was reviewing, rewriting really, DoD 5000.02, which is our acquisition guidance document. It lays out all the procedures, requirements for our program managers. And as we went through that, we collected all of the statutory and regulatory requirements in a series of tables. And I was astonished, I guess, and dismayed at the length of that section of the document, 20 or 30 pages of tables of requirements, one after the other. Overlapping, confusing in many cases. So I decided to start a legislative initiative, and this has synchronized itself pretty well with what Congressman Thornberry's doing. It's led right now by Gabe Sorzano, who's right in front of me. And the idea of this initiative is to just go through, don't challenge the intent behind these things. Many of the laws that have been built up have a very good intent, but they've been done piecemeal over the years. So they've led to a lot of confusion, much more complicated, much more difficult to deal with body of statute and regulation that is required. So we've put together a few quick wins we put up last year, hope to have in the FY15 bill. And we have a longer list we're working on now that we hope to get into the next year's bill. That table, that section that I talked to you about with all those pages and pages, we're going to cut it about in half, we think. So that's a substantial improvement in the burden. And at the end of the day, it's the burden on our managers to do things that are done for bureaucratic reasons as opposed to for reasons of actually planning and managing their programs. So that's one. That's basically our internal processes that guide our processes. Another big one is in the area of the federal acquisition regulation. Dick Jimin, who's my leader for procurement for contracting, isn't here today, but he's leading a team, again, working with the Hill and the White House and OMB on this to try to simplify that body of regulations. And the third area I'll mention is one that we're working with industry. Marilyn is here, and she's part of this. We reached out to industry and said, what are the things that impact you the most in terms of overhead that isn't productive? And we got a lot of ideas back from industry. We've been working on this for about a year now. And areas include Earned Value Management, Truth in Negotiations Act, Better Buying, Buy America requirements, there's several others. And we're looking at those. One that plagues industry particularly is how we handle things that are commercial or commercial-like. So what we're trying to do there is work with industry to remove some of that overhead that we impose on them that doesn't really give us a return for that investment. So it's a multi-front thing. It's a long journey. Better Buying Power, which we started in 2010, has a major section on eliminating unproductive processes and bureaucracy. And we're just going to have to keep at it, because one of the iron rules, unfortunately, about bureaucracies is they tend to grow if left alone. And another thing that I think is true is that the Congress, and understandable frustration, tends to add additional requirements over time. Those create additional bureaucracy. So simplifying those and getting the things that we really need in terms of oversight and management is really the right way to go. It's going to take a long time. It's going to take a lot of work, but we're committed to it. We're going to continue it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Houston.
Well, it's my arm.
Uh-oh.
Testing.
There we go.
There we go. Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. I guess, just to take this from an industry perspective, I think it's important to reflect on the last panel and a lot of the discussion we had about just the world events that we're engaged in today and the global security challenges that are certainly not subsiding and I think are going to continue to increase. And as we step back from that and consider that as we look out into the future, we're going to see adversaries that are much more capable, much more unpredictable. And so we, as any nation, the first priority for us is to protect our citizens, and national security is key. So if you put that context around it and think about what do you need a strong, viable industrial base. Representing that team up here today, I want to talk a little bit about how we see the situation. First of all, we often talk, Secretary Kendall and I and others talk about this need to maintain our military capability, not just maintain it, but have technologically superior capability. And if you don't have a strong industrial base, we won't be able to do that. Large companies like Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and Raytheon and others that are represented here have probably the scale to be able to deal with the decline in defense spending that we're facing right now. We'll be smaller companies. Many of us have significantly reduced our headcount and reduced our facilities, but we deal through that. But one of the areas that I'm most concerned about, and I know my colleagues are most concerned about, are those third and fourth tier suppliers that are critical to our industry. These are the companies that are into innovation, that bring the creative ideas and the innovation and the capability to our industry that is so critical. And so while we'll talk a lot in this panel about things we need to do from an acquisition reform standpoint, and I certainly welcome that, my colleagues certainly welcome that, very little will happen if we don't get our arms around this budget situation. Because the budget situation, sequestration, we all agree, is bad news. It's bad public policy. We need to do away with it. But even this instability of ups and downs in our budget and the uncertainty that creates throughout the supply chain, and most critically on those small suppliers, is something that we just absolutely must address. So that's one area that I think we need to keep in front of us. The other one is that from an acquisition reform standpoint, we certainly welcome it. As Secretary Kendall said, we are working closely with the DoD. One thing I would say is that forums like this, the activities that the department is doing to bring industry in, is critically important, because you don't want to make short-term decisions that have long-term consequences, unintended consequences. And so while we have a lot of ideas, a long list of ideas, and many of them are very credible, strong ideas, as Chairman Thornberry said, we need to look at them in a disciplined, structured way and make sure what we do does not have an implication long-term that we didn't expect through this process. So those are just some of the things that I would raise. The last point I would make is that while we're concerned about this supply chain, we're concerned about our companies being strong and viable and being able to deal with the decline in budget spending as well as the inefficient processes that we're all going to try to work on improving, we're also concerned about continuing to attract talent to this industry. You know, that for any organization, it's the people that make the difference. And we want to make sure that this is an industry that they want to come to, because we do some of the most interesting and challenging work in the world. It is innovative, it is critical for our nation. It's, you know, you can be a part of something in our company where, and our colleagues in the industry, where you know you're making a difference, where you're supporting the men and women in uniform, where you're helping to protect our citizens. But if it's an uncertain industry, if it's one where you're not sure that you can achieve your career aspirations, then that's a problem. We need to attract the scientists, the technologists, the engineers. We're going to see probably 50% of our workforce that can retire in the next 5 years. And so it's my responsibility, it's my colleagues' responsibility, but it's certainly all of our responsibility to make this an industry where we want our best and brightest to come to work on the superior military capability that we need to protect our nation and to move forward in our country. Thank you.
Dr. Zackheim.
Okay, I guess this is working. First of all, I also want to thank the Reagan Library, and I want to say something about Chairman McKeon, because I've seen him operate in a very different way. And those of you who don't really know him well, this is one of the classiest people on the face of the earth. And I really think that we're going to miss him a lot, because he was not just a great legislator, he's a wonderful human being. Anybody wants to ask me about it more later, I'll be happy to tell. Secretary James opened the door for me to talk about President Reagan. And one of the things that's so critical, and was so critical during the buildup, and I was there in 01, 02, 03 through 07, was that the president was personally engaged. And I remember one time I was at a cabinet meeting, of course I was against the wall, and I get a note from Bud McFarlane, who's the Deputy National Security Advisor. He was concerned that there was some rumblings against the 15 carrier, 600 ship Navy. So we exchanged some notes. Next thing I know, Bud gets up and he whispers into Judge Clark's ear. Judge Clark was the National Security Advisor. And there's a discussion about something completely different. But the judge whispers something to the president. And next thing you know, the president cuts off whoever was speaking. I think it was Gene Kirkpatrick, which is hard to do. And he goes, I understand that some people don't like the idea of a 15 carrier, 600 ship Navy. Now, I happen to like the idea. Does anybody disagree with me? That was the end of that discussion. So the personal commitment at the very top is just so crucial to whatever we want to do on defense. Obviously, it gets very hard when you're number 6. Arnold will figure out how to do his part. He always does. But it's very hard when 5 people have already spoken in front of you. So I want to make a few quick points. The first is what Undersecretary Kendall's doing, what Secretary James is doing. What Deborah and Frank are doing is really good work. And the key is continuity. Those of you in the business know that every time a new general comes in, what's the first thing he or she has? A 100-day plan, which means the predecessor was an idiot. We've got to get away from that. We've got to build on what's being done. This is a bipartisan thing. We're all trying to do the same thing. So whoever comes in 2016, or if people move on before that, we've got to make sure they're building on what's being done, the way, frankly, Frank built on what Ash did. Really, really very, very important. Another point, we do not have as educated a workforce as we need. You can come out of school, get your master's, and then never take another course for the rest of your civilian civil service career. Now, you know Moore's Law. Everything changes every 18 months. Technology is changing like crazy. You heard that just now. And we've got people who are still living 30 years ago as far as their knowledge is concerned. How do you get a better consumer that way? What we need to make sure of is that nobody can get promoted to the SES or to general officer or to program manager unless you adopt Goldwater-Nichols' approach. You know, in Goldwater-Nichols, you've got to do joint duty before you move up to flag or a general officer rank. You need to spend at least a year in a top technical school, the MITs, the RPIs of this world, or else a year in industry, so you understand how the bottom line works. And that's going to change the way our civil servants, not our Frank Kendalls, I'm not worried about Frank, but he was complaining about bureaucracy. We got to get to the bureaucracy. That's going to change the way they think about technology, the way they think about business. I was just on the Defense Business Board panel. I think Dennis Bovin is here. He may talk about this later. We were looking at contracting outside the defense industrial base. Well, one of the biggest biases that the civil servants have is against profit. It's like a sin. This country's been built on profit. Spend a year in industry, you'll know it a lot better. And finally, one more point, and that is we still have to make it harder for people to accept engineering change proposals. They drive industry crazy, they drive government crazy, and oh, by the way, they delay programs and drive the costs up. I don't think any major ECP should be approved at any level below the undersecretary level or the military equivalent. Make it harder to change programs. Make it harder to change requirements. You want to save money, you want to save time, that's one way to do it. I'll stop here and give Arnold the next hour.
Then we'll be done. Thank you, General Pinero. Please.
Thanks to the Library and Foundation, and I know our friend and colleague John Lehman is listening in to the live cast, so I want to make the historical record. It was John that slipped Dove the note about the 600-ship Navy first. Look, reforming how the Pentagon does business, we know is critical to our future, a strong national security now and in the future. And for decades, those of us in the defense community, we focus more on the top line or the inputs, how much we spend, rather than focusing on what we get for what we spend. So it's long overdue for us to shift that focus and start worrying more about how we can increase the combat power of our military while reducing the support costs. And if we don't take that approach and make significant reforms in 1, acquisition, 2, DOD's massive overhead and infrastructure, and 3, the long-term life cycle costs of the volunteer force, we're going to have warfighting forces that are dramatically smaller, they're going to be less well-trained, they're going to be less well-equipped to meet the future, to meet the threats of today's very unstable and dangerous world, not to mention the future, more dangerous, more unstable world. Acquisition reform, number 1 on the list, where history would suggest we ought to be skeptical. Actually, I'm very optimistic that we're going to get the right improvements. And we're going to get the right improvements because of 2 of the people on this panel in the Congress and the Pentagon, led by Chairman Thornberry and led by Undersecretary Kendall, who are bringing a renewed focus to this area, a lot of thoughtful, objective, data-driven processes, and focusing on what's realistic and in the art of the possible. And our industry leaders are heavily engaged, as Secretary James said, Marilyn Houston, Wes Bush, David Joyce, the new incoming head of AIA. As the chairman of NDIA, I just delivered a comprehensive set of proposed recommended reforms on behalf of our industry to the Pentagon, the Congressional, and the industry leaders. The next one, number 2, I'm not so optimistic about the prospects of reducing DOD's massive infrastructure, which is approximately $195 billion, and it has the same size as the gross domestic product of the entire country of Ireland. If DOD-wide spending has gone from 5% of the budget to 20% of the budget, and if you look at the size of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the combatant commands, and the defense agencies, over 250,000 people working in them, spending about $115 billion a year, and there's nary a trigger puller in the lot. Secretary of Work is working very hard in this area. Michelle Flournoy, the CEO of CNAS, has produced a very impressive and persuasive study on the kind of reforms that we could make in these areas. But these have been proven very difficult, as Secretaries Panetta and Gates have found, and Secretary Hagel is finding, as he tries to reduce the headquarters. The bureaucracy is very resilient to changes in these areas. However, the final area, the Achilles heel right now for the department, is what I would call the fully burdened and life cycle costs of the all-volunteer force, which is currently on an unsustainable course. Next year, the cost of compensation for retirement in health care for military retirees and their dependents will be greater than the entire $140 billion annual appropriation in the military personnel accounts that includes all active duty, all active Guard and Reserve personnel. It's also important to note that 80% of the people that have served in Iraq and Afghanistan that serve in our military never get a nickel of these benefits because they never make it to the 20-year retirement. The cost of pay and some benefits for active personnel has gone up 82% since 2001 for a slightly smaller force. In that same time frame, healthcare costs have gone up 135%, the cost of the DoD dependent school system has gone up 120%, and even the subsidy to the DoD grocery store has gone up 36%. So in conclusion, our number one goal in all these reforms should be increasing our warfighting capabilities while educating the American people that these internal cost drivers are causing what I term the ever-shrinking fighting force. Thank you.
In a speech this week, Deputy Secretary of Defense Work said, quote, "The Defense Department is often held up as an example of wasteful spending, yet when we try to identify what we see as wasteful spending, Congress forces us to keep spending." There's a political environment here, and I just want to ask Congressman Thornberry, how do you achieve these effectiveness or these efficiencies in a political context when so many members of Congress have parochial and self-interest? It seems like there should be a culture change here, too. How are you addressing that?
Well, it's absolutely true that any member of Congress has responsibility to represent his or her district or state. And that's not going to change, and it will be a factor in what we do. I disagree, however, with the characterization that the Pentagon identifies waste and Congress, because of parochial reasons, just refuses to go along with it. One example is last year, the Pentagon proposed, I may get this reversed, retiring the U-2 and keeping the Global Hawk, or maybe it was the other way around. And then the next year it completely reversed the other way. Well, Congress didn't go along with either one. And when they completely flipped what the proposal was. A-10 is another example this year. Sorry, I'm picking on the Air Force here, I guess. From the Air Force perspective, they're trying to balance how they get the most capability with shrinking resources, and so the A-10, they believe, needs to be retired. If you're the guy on the ground that the A-10 has come and saved in Afghanistan, you're not so fond of that. So part of this are judgment calls that only Congress, looking at the whole, other than the very top levels of the Pentagon, can make. Last point I'd make about it is this. The Pentagon has to send us budget proposals based on what the current law is. The current law includes sequestration, etc. I am not willing to concede that that's the way it should be. I'm not willing to concede we have to come to grips with a smaller defense and a smaller U.S. role in the world. Now, at some point, we may have to say, okay, the American people have spoken, this is what we can do, and we've got to make adjustments and have the best force within that lower military capability. But I don't think we're there yet. I think the results of this election show the American people are not there yet. And so some of the times when we disagree with cuts the Pentagon wants to make, it's because we don't want to concede to a smaller military.
Secretary James, could you respond to that? Because you are trying to retire the A-10, and that may or may not happen. How do you see it?
So the way I would term it, Chris and Mr. Chairman, I would term it that we have done our very best to identify priorities and to make tough choices. So in a perfect world, I'll say, where we had much more top line, we could do many more additional things. But just as any of us in our own families would try to do if suddenly our income dropped by 20%, because that's about what we're looking at in the Air Force. If you go back just a couple of years ago and compare the program that we put together and then compare that with what the resources are that we're actually going to have in FY15, it's about a 20% cut. So that's a big deal. And therefore, you have to make priorities, and you can't do it all. And so for this reason, we have proposed retiring some of these systems. You mentioned several of them. And by the way, in the military, everything that we do involves risk. There's no risk-free strategies. And so these are calculations, best military judgment of where we can most assume the risk. So in the case of the A-10, which has been a wonderful close air support platform, we believe, I mean, we know because it's been happening for the last years in Afghanistan and Iraq that we do have other aircraft that can perform that mission. Something like 80% of the missions in Iraq and Afghanistan have been performed by aircraft other than the A-10. So we know that we have that. It's a sacred mission. We will cover it. And over time, we would like to retire the A-10 in order to reinvest those dollars into other higher priorities because we can't do it all. And those priorities are readiness of today, which I told you is strained, and also modernizing so that we have the best Air Force of the future. On the Global Hawk and the U-2, if anything, that was a tougher choice because if you would ask the combatant commanders of today, if you had an extra dollar for the United States Air Force, what would you want us to spend it on? And they would without doubt say ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So if anything, that was probably the tougher of the two choices. The reason why we changed course was because the life cycle costs for the Global Hawk came down, and we thought it would have a longer future than the U-2, which is considerably older. But again, a very tough choice. And if we had the additional money, I dare say that might be one of the first things that we would buy back. If ever there was a good idea, though, and I think we can all agree with it in principle, but we break down on the particulars, I believe it's base closures. So putting my old SAIC hat from industry back on, we would never spend money on buildings and infrastructure that we didn't need. We would so rather have spent the money on investing in our people and our technology and in our future. But we can't get the authority for the base closures. And I think everybody, even in Congress, would agree that you don't want to spend money on excess infrastructure. But I think it's the fear of, how would it impact an individual base? And of course, I can never say how it would impact an individual base. I just know that we need to do it so that we can reinvest the money.
All tough choices. Just switching gears here for a quick minute. Ms. Houston from industry, you've been with Lockheed for more than 30 years. I'm just curious if you had Secretary Kendall's job for a day, what you would do. And we're going to go to you after this, Secretary Kendall. You're not if you were CEO of Lockheed Martin, and I want to, for the record, say I am making no judgment here as to who would get the promotion.
Yeah. I know who would get better compensation.
Well, I would just say, first and foremost, that I know just from my time spending with Secretary Kendall, it is a very tough, complex job. So, I have a tough, complex job, as does he. If I were in his job, I would do exactly what he's doing, and that is continue to focus on this budget issue that we have, because it drives everything. If we don't get the uncertainty out, if we don't get stability in the budget situation, then the rest of it is sort of we're not going to get acquisition reform. We're not going to get those other things that we need. So I think he's front and center on the right things. Around the better buying power initiatives that he has underway, I think that's helpful to communicate to industry on what he's looking at in terms of initiatives to be a better buyer for the U.S. taxpayer and for supporting the men and women in uniform. What is important, though, as I said earlier, and which he is doing and across the department is happening, is to engage industry in those discussions. Because if industry is not involved in those discussions, then we can't collaboratively come up with the innovative solutions that are going to make a difference, or we may have unintended consequences because of not having the full picture. So to the credit of the department and certainly Secretary Kendall, we're having those discussions, and we just need to maintain that, continue that. There are constraints, as there always are, and they seem to have grown. I didn't realize it till I got in this job, how difficult it is sometimes to have that level of communication. But to the credit of the department, they're working very hard on stepping up the communication with industry, and I think that's what's going to make a difference. Then I guess the third thing would be something that is a strong focus is not only on today's budget problem, but looking long term. We had a discussion about it this morning in the earlier panel. It's very important that we don't lose our technological edge. We see our adversaries all around the world are spending more and more of their GDP on defense, on getting additional capabilities, and if we allow ourselves to gap at this time, you don't make it back. And it's critically important that we have that technological superiority and continue to invest. Even in a down market, even in declining spending, that we look beyond today and make sure that we're investing in the capability that's going to keep our military strong.
Chairman and CEO Kendall, what would you do as luck?
Don't let that stock price plummet, Frank. It's on you.
Well, okay, one of the things I would do, I was answer the previous question just the way she just did. Two things that came to mind immediately. One, reduce overhead, which I know Lockheed is doing, and the other is invest in the future. Defense is a cyclical business, and I would ask all of our CEOs to take the long-term look at that and prepare yourselves for the next turnaround. The threats, as Marilyn mentioned, are getting worse. I think there is not a general awareness of the degree to which they're getting worse. I'm trying to educate people about this. Unfortunately, a lot of the information is classified. I think I've started to get through. I've been up on the Hill a lot about this. I've been having conversations with White House people about this. And certainly I have a lot of support from the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary. And I think you're going to hear some of that when Secretary Hagel speaks to you later today. We have got to get serious about the threats to our technological superiority. So that investing in that and being prepared for that, because it's going to happen. We just don't want to be too far behind when we find out that we really have a problem there. It becomes more generally known. I think our relationship with industry in general is very positive and constructive. Just spent a Saturday about 5 hours with a number of people with AIA, with key leadership there, and I think that was a very constructive dialogue that we had. I haven't done one recently with Arnold, but we've had a number of dinners with the NDIA people as well. So we're very open to having that dialogue. It's very important that we reach out to each other and listen to each other. I learned an awful lot from those conversations. I mentioned some of the things we're doing in that regard earlier in terms of reducing red tape specifically, and I think that's been a very helpful conversation as well. So.
Thanks. General Pinero, you've said that the Pentagon, with its generous pay and retirement packages, is at risk of becoming a benefits company that occasionally kills a terrorist. Isn't the real issue, I mean, we've talked a lot about acquisition reform, but shouldn't huge retirement costs and these benefits, these entitlements, shouldn't that get more attention?
Absolutely. I mean, let's face it, with the threats we face in the world, the people that would attack us, the terrorists, our enemies, they are not deterred, by the fact that we have a commissary card or a benefit. And to the extent they're deterred by a Marine with a sharp bayonet. And basically, what's driving our deficits are the entitlement programs, both domestic entitlements and military entitlements. Defense discretionary spending, domestic discretionary spending are not the drivers of the deficit and not the drivers of what puts our long-term security at risk, our nation's fiscal posture. When it comes to the Department of Defense, as we've said, these benefits have grown over time, and they've grown to be tremendous. We shouldn't surprise us. Former Secretary of Defense Thomas Gates was asked by President Nixon to run a commission to look at, should we go from the draft, and this was in 1970, to an all-volunteer force. At the time, we had the draft for Vietnam. At the time, all our military leaders, heck no, we can't go to a volunteer force. We got to stick with the draft. That's a guaranteed source of manpower. Gates recommended going to the volunteer force. It started in '73, the same year I went to work on the Senate staff. For a decade, we had to kind of try to save it. But Gates says it will not be sustainable over the long term if you don't make three fundamental changes. Number one, you've got to get rid of the 20-year cliff retirement system. Number two, you've got to get rid of the up-or-out promotion system that pushes our most experienced and most qualified officers out at the 20-year point. And three, you've got to change military pay from time and grade to skills and performance. None of those three changes have been made, so 41 years later, we have these significant problems. The other point I would make is, everybody says, Arnold, holy smokes, when you start talking about changing benefits, it's all pain, there's no gain. Absolutely wrong. If you grandfather everybody in the system today, as we should, there should be no changes made retroactively. When we changed the retired pay for the military in 1979 from the last day that you served to a high 3 and grandfathered everybody for 20 years, there was a lot of screams and howls in '79, but 20 years later, we saved $2 billion a year. If, for example, you reform military retirement, and Dove is on the Retirement Commission. I hope they'll make some bold and innovative proposals when they report in March. If you changed it, again, grandfather every single person in the system today, so 20 years out, if you went from a high 3 to a high 5, if you went from a multiplier times their base pay, instead of today's formula, 2.5% times their base pay to 2.0, and if you change the retirement age from 20 to 25 years, so you would retire at age 48 instead of 43 like they are now and live to age 84, In the next 20 years, you would save $200 billion in the accrual funds that we have to pay into the retirement and the medical. So you would save money. That's half the sequester. By the way, the other reason that we've got to make these changes is right now today on the books, there's a $1 trillion liability for the future costs of retirement and health care that's in no one's budget. $1 trillion is real money, and it would basically the entire sequester. So that's why there's a compelling case to make these changes now.
Dr. Zackheim, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, no pressure from Arnold. So first of all, obviously we're in the middle of deliberations, so I'm not going to get into the details there. But one thing I can say for sure, in public, on TV, we're going to grandfather everything. So don't worry about that part. That was a decision we made early on. It's the only decision you can make. These young men and women signed the contract with America. America has to keep its contract. In terms of changing things, we've approached it a little bit differently. When you think about the AVF, when Arnold and I both had hair, the person who came into the military was generally young, male, and single. That's not the way it is today. They're young, but they're married, men and women, very often with children. Very often these young people, the E2s and E3s, already have children. So the priorities that they have changed. Childcare, really important. Education, really important. When you're 22 years old, you don't think as much about retirement. When you're 38, you certainly do. So we have to balance the fact that over time, the military itself has different priorities. We're starting off with that. But I think, and I agree with Arnold, there are ways to save money even as you modernize. That's going to be our approach, because the fact of the matter is, it's not only the military personnel account, and now I'm putting on my old green eye shade, that is an entitlement in a sense, because they all think it's an entitlement. Let's be honest. I don't care if it's an allowance, like basic allowance for housing, or straight pay. They think it's an entitlement. You take something away from them, they're giving their lives for their country, they're going to be pretty upset. But there's the additional entitlement. Most of our health care program, the Defense Health Program, is actually the operations and maintenance account. Which means, for instance, that when the sequester hits and the president exempts military personnel, operations and maintenance has to take the cut. But you know you're not going to mess with defense health, so the rest of operations and maintenance takes the cut. This is totally untenable, and that's why I really hope something is done about the sequester. But beyond that, we have to think about, is our healthcare system, we're spending as much on healthcare as the British defense budget is, virtually. Is the system providing all the things that our military expected to provide? And the answer is no. Has to do with whether you can get military treatment facility support, where you live, if you're a reserve, if you're active, all kinds of, I mean, we issued a book of benefits that's this thick. It's the Encyclopedia of Military Benefits. And it really depends on who you are, where you are, what your status is. We want to make sure that if you're in the military, you get the best health benefit. And guess what? Just like in the civilian sector, you can save money and still do better. That's what we're trying to do.
In an article recently in Foreign Affairs magazine, William Lynn, a former Deputy Secretary of Defense, wrote that Google may not need defense contracts, but the Pentagon needs more and better relationships with companies like Google, who traditionally have shied away from doing work with the government for many reasons, profit, bureaucracy, that sort of thing. I wonder, Secretary Kendall and Congressman Thornberry, if we could start with you, Congressman, in terms of your reform efforts, are you looking at companies like that and making it easier for the Pentagon to do business with them? Does that factor into your thinking?
Yeah, I think it has to. The point's been made several times in recent years that in the past, the Pentagon has largely driven innovation. Today, it's the private sector that drives innovation, by and large. And so we have to, if we're going to defend the country with the best and latest technology, draw on what the private sector is doing. And if we make it too hard, Google it just says it's not worth messing with you people. The cost versus the benefits, and so they just don't deal with the federal government. So, as Mr. Kendall said, making it simpler, reducing the number of regulations that companies would have to hire whole new departments to wade their way through. I mean, that's part of the idea of where we want to go. Obviously, you don't get there all at once. The other key point about that is, as Marilyn mentioned, is a lot of innovation happens in small companies. They cannot afford a team of lawyers and accountants to meet all the DoD regulations. And yet we need to draw on that innovation as well. So the urgency and imperative of making it easier for private companies to deal with the Department of Defense, I think, is only growing.
So, Secretary, how do we do that, Secretary Ken?
It's a real problem, and I agree with Congressman Thornberry that the small businesses are the ones that we really need to be focused on. We do a fair amount of business with commercial companies of various types. A lot of commercial companies who are parts providers, for example, can come in as parts of the supply chain, and we do that. We have to be careful about the security of that supply chain and how we buy that way, though. The part of that I'm most concerned about is the part that creates innovation, that brings innovation to the table. And the latest round of Better Buying Power initiatives is focused more on that problem. It addresses barriers to commercial companies coming in. Are the way we do auditing and accounting is a barrier. The way we just do contracting in general is a barrier. Some of our requirements for disclosure of information are a barrier. So we need to address that. In particular, though, we need to address it for small companies. In my previous life, I did a little bit of venture capital work, and I worked with companies who were trying to break into government contracting. They had products that were essentially military products, but they came from kind of a commercial development out of universities in some cases. In other cases, we have companies that are trying to get components in and break in and compete with a deeply entrenched a prime contractor who's already there and displace that one for a component. We need to create mechanisms for people to do this. So we're working this hard. I've got a team working the barriers in general to commercial products coming in. The Small Business Innovative Research Program has been a great success. I've got Andre Gudger sitting in front of me. For the first time, I think, in decades, the Department of Defense has met its small business goals this year, and it's largely due to the work of this individual. So we are promoting, and we have been, as long as I've been back in government, small businesses. It's been a major thrust of this administration. They're the seeds of all this creativity. These are the guys, men and women, who are coming out of universities, coming out of other parts of the private sector, have a great idea and just need to find a way to get it into a customer and get started. The Rapid Innovation Fund, which we're still analyzing, which came out of the House Armed Services Authority, is another tool we're using. So I completely agree with these concerns. We've got to protect our interests as we do this and think about all the things that bear on this problem, but we definitely need to do better in this area.
Dr. Zakheim, did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I would actually. As I mentioned, I was on a Defense Business Board task force that looked at this. It's not just the small companies, it's the Googles. They're not small. They're actually capitalized more than you are, Marilyn. And one of their concerns, apart from the profit concern, is the intellectual property concern. You come up with something, and the way, of course, industry works is they come up with something, they invest their own R&D, the whole IR&D program, Frank's trying to fix it, and he's doing a good job, but it doesn't really compensate for companies that feel they really can develop something. So what do? They develop something, they pour their money into it, and they're going to make it back in profit. And they're going to keep the intellectual property. Well, what does the government tell you? Not only can you not make more than 8 or 9% on some of these things, and maybe less than that, we want your intellectual property. Well, why in God's name should Google hand their intellectual property over to the government? To a bunch of civil servants who, as I said, haven't gone to a course in the last 25 years. So they say, no, thank you. You're not even our major market. Our major market is the entire world, except China, which doesn't let them in. But there's an awful lot of other people out there. So we'll stay away from defense and we'll make good money, and our share price will keep going up. It's those people we also have to get. So we have to think about that. Now, there are ways right now, without having Mac Thornberry or his colleagues change any legislation, to do that. There's a thing in the Federal Acquisition Regulations, FAR Part 12, and I don't want to get too technical, just let me say that that particular regulation has been used mostly to buy things like Coca-Cola, whereas you could also buy the components that go into aircraft and ships and tanks, and you plug and play with them. And you can get all kinds of innovations, and it's quicker, there are fewer restrictions, and it would be much more attractive to industry. How do we know this? Because we talked to the companies before we wrote our report. There are ways of doing it, and again, it's not Frank Kendall who's the problem, but he's got folks below him, and they don't like this at all.
In just a minute, we're going to take questions from the audience. I believe there should be microphones. Yes, Secretary Kendall.
I want to respond to that because the idea of buying commercial is really a mixed bag, and the intellectual property issue is really a very complex one. We respect people's intellectual property rights to ownership. We cannot compel anybody to sell us their intellectual property. On the other hand, I was in industry for a long time, and I know how industry is used as a weapon, uses intellectual property as a weapon. Basically, you establish a position that gives you a competitive advantage. And part of that is being in a position where, and I've seen a number of cases in the government where it's been incredibly frustrating to not be able to have competition because someone has secured a position on a platform or a platform itself based on their intellectual property rights. So what we've been trying to do over the last few years is educate our workforce about this, let them understand the inherent rights that the government does own whenever it does a purchase from industry, and then understand what intellectual property rights industry has, and then try to get those priced and get a value on them through the competitive process as much as we can. We also have to be very careful. We don't need everybody's intellectual property rights. We need a subset of them for the purposes that the government has. In general, we want to compete future maintenance, for example. So we need the intellectual property that is associated with that. We can do that by using, as Marilyn mentioned, modular designs, where we control the interfaces. But we have to be very good at this because it's a complicated, difficult thing to do, and it takes a real deep understanding of designs and what's really in them to do it successfully. I want to say a word about profit, because Dov mentioned that, and I think Marilyn did also. Profit is a necessity for business. I've been a businessman, we get that, and it is not a way you can force people to cut their costs. There's a level of profitability which is essential for a business to still be a business. So we respect that, and we want to do our business deals so that we honor that. At the same time, profit is a tool that we can use to incentivize people to do a better job for us. And we want to be as effective as that as we can be, without putting industry at unreasonable risk. This, again, requires a lot of professionalism. And a lot of these things come back to what Dov said about professionalism in the workforce. It's why I introduced it as Better Buying Power 2 as one of the major initiatives that we're continuing to pursue. We need to strike exactly the right balance, or as best as we can, in all the business deals we do with industry so that they have a reasonable chance to make a profit. And I am delighted if industry can make a large margin and give us a lower cost, because what we care about in the end is cost. And our negotiators need to understand that. So we try to put incentives in place that work for industry, that aren't unreasonable from the point of view of the risk that industry has to bear, and yet get us the behaviors that we want out of industry at the end. That's a hard thing to do. The first negotiation Marilyn and I were involved in was Lot 5 for the F-35. It was a very, very tough, intense negotiation, and I think we ended up in a reasonable place there. I want our people to be getting the best deal they can for the taxpayer, but at the same time, I want them to be fair to industry and give them a reasonable business deal so that Marilyn can double her stock price and I can get a cheaper F-35 at the same time. That's what I want.
Great. As I said before, we've got a couple microphones set up, and we've got a few minutes for questions. It'll be first come, first served. Please, sir.
Thank you. Hello.
Someone help him with them.
How do you get it? Where's your technician? Here it is.
There you go.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm former Congressman Jody Aguardi, Westchester County, New York, in the 80s, the first certified public accountant practicing CPA ever elected to Congress. I originally introduced the CFO Act in 1986, twice more in 1987. It was passed in 1990. You've got two major problems. Let me talk about briefly the numbers. The budget problem and a public relations problem. What's the budget problem? The budget this year, round numbers, $3.8 trillion. 65% of it, including the interest we pay out, is mandatory, including obviously a program like Medicaid. So 35% is discretionary. Right. Half that budget is the defense. So you got a problem to compete against the others in that 35%. Education, you name it, all kinds of important things. To do that, you got to make a good case. How do you make a good case? I'll get to the public relations problem, accountability. When the DOD, the requirement for financial statements, the act that I introduced, started in 1994. The Comptroller General, in his report, the last statement put out, says that the armed services, the DOD, will not be able to comply and get an opinion because there are such material weaknesses in the way you account for things, and you want more money.
So is there a question in there?
The question is, why is it taking so long? I mean, it's not rocket science accounting. You got to get the right people in there to try to figure out why you can't get an audit of the DOD.
Secretary James and Dr. Zatcon.
I'm going to, rather than try to explain why, I'm going to agree with you. It has taken too long. And I mentioned briefly that this is something we're working hard on in the Air Force. We're working hard across the Department of Defense, including Frank, Bob Work above him. I think, stay tuned, very shortly, like within the next year, you're going to see that we're going to have major advances. We're going to get there.
I had to grapple with that when I was comptroller. My successor had to grapple with that. Bob Hale, who's here, had to grapple with that. It's not that people are deliberately trying to not get good audits, obviously. But one thing, and you know this very well, for instance, we talked about facilities. Arnold rightly said there are an awful lot of facilities we've got to get rid of. Some of these are quite old. How do you value them? How do you come up with the right numbers? I mean, sure, you could come up with numbers, but if you want a clean audit, you can't just throw numbers out there. You're not even going to get a qualified audit. And, we're talking about a huge enterprise, $600 billion, give or take. Nothing like that anywhere else. Never had audits before till you actually push this act, and it's just taking time. And I think with the best of will and the best efforts from guys like me and Bob Hale and our successors, you can't hammer the services enough. That's number one. Then there's a cultural factor. And that is simply the fact that somebody in uniform in particular sees his or her job as going out and fighting for their country and not working the back office problem. So guys like me are back office guys, and we just don't command the same degree of attention. And I think instead of looking at the glass as being half empty, think of it as being half full, that people like Secretary James have been able to push people, even as they're fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, to worry about clean audits.
General Pinero, and then we'll take a question over here.
They are making progress, but one of the things they're not making progress on, and one of the reasons is they do not know and they do not track the fully burdened and life cycle cost of their personnel, active duty, Guard and Reserve, or defense civilians. Unlike industry, Maryland, West, others, they have to track their long-term pension costs. They can't just take those off the books. As I said, DOD's got $1 trillion liability for future costs for retiree health care and pensions that aren't on the books, and they're not even on the books right now. So they've got to come to grips with the fully burdened and life cycle costs of their people. They've got to start figuring out what they are, and they've got to account for them and track them every year.
One of the answers, by the way, is a capital budget. You don't have a capital budget, you throw all your expenditures into the deficit, and people don't understand the difference between what you need now and what you need later. 37 states have a capital budget. The United States of America doesn't, and I dare say the Department of Defense doesn't have one either.
Thank you. Let's hear from this gentleman over here.
Thank you all for your time.
Oh, no,
Thank you all for your time. I just wanted to sort of propose a visual.
I'm sorry, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Prescott Pollen. I'm with a company called 300 Below. And thank you very much for the comment earlier that was made on small business, because it is a challenge for a lot of the smaller organizations that are trying to do innovative things and get those ideas to come up. Innovation is much like cooking a lobster. You've got the people underneath that have that burning desire and passion to get the water lit on fire, and the people at the top that are the chefs that are trying to extract the lobster and pull it out. And you've got policy decisions and middle management that are essentially boiling water. And for these bigger organizations, it's like, at what amount of money is it worth sticking your hand in that boiling water to pull the lobster out and say, hey, dinner's ready? the solution, I think, to overcome a lot of the innovation challenges is better tools. It's a lot of what you're talking about. How do we work through getting that lobster out for everybody to benefit and have a feast? And I'm wondering, what are some of the tools that we're proposing in order to get dinner ready? Where are the changes being done? Because right now I'm not seeing it as a smaller business to make it easier for groups like us that want to contribute something to the feast.
Anyone want to take that on?
We've created some tools. Andre's created one that's been particularly valuable to us, which is called MaxPrac. It allows us to understand the market out there, do market research much more effectively, so people can see where there are small businesses that other people are using that they could use as well. We also set up something called a innovation marketplace, which is a Defense Technical Information Center, where we're tracking IR&D that the companies are doing and also posting information anybody can look at about the interests of the government so people can see what we're after. And I think as somebody mentioned, we're taking a harder look at all these areas as we try to increase the return on our contracted R&D and our other investments.
If I could just add also to that from an industry standpoint, you know, for our company and for many of my colleagues' companies, 60 to 70% of our sales are in the supply base. And so it's important for us to help our suppliers, and oftentimes we're buying commercial items from them and then we're dealing with all of the government regulations, and I think that keeps those suppliers in the mix. They're able to provide their components, their commercial items to us, and then we in turn know how to do business with the federal government, and so through that process we're able to deal with the regulations. Because to your point, it does come with it certain compliance and things that you have to put in place in order to deal with the various regulations that you might not have to do in the commercial marketplace.
Well, thanks. That's all the time we have for today. I want to thank our panel once more. It was a great panel and a great discussion. Thank you very much for joining us.